Hello and welcome to our May CPMC Advocacy Network Town Hall. I'm Father George Williams, member of the Executive Committee of CPMC, and today we have as our guest speaker, Reverend Ron Stieff, who is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. He's also the Executive Director of the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, which is an interfaith organization of more than 325 religious faith groups committed to ending US-sponsored torture. And he is a national leader and a faith strategist on ending torture by the CIA and also ending the torture of solitary confinement in US prisons, which is more the focus today of our conversation. So for those of you who are joining us live, if you wish at some point to unmute yourself and ask a question, you may do so. We want to have this be an open conversation. And also, if you just want to have a question, but you don't want to come and do it by voice, you can type it into the chat feature and I will monitor those so that Ron can address your comments or questions. So a little bit of background too. Reverend Stieff from 1999 to 2008 was the director of the Washington, D.C. office of the UCC, where he led advocacy for 5,500 congregations and over 1 million members of the United Church of Christ across the country. And that was addressing a broad range of domestic and international issues. He also taught as an adjunct faculty member of the Pacific School of Religion and Starr King School for Ministry, both in Berkeley and the McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago. He has an undergraduate degree in philosophy from the University of Montana. He has a Master's of Arts in Social Ethics and an MDiv from the Pacific School of Religion. And he and his wife, who is also a Reverend Sandy Arla, have a son and 2 grandchildren. So it's wonderful to have you with us, Ron. And I know you wanted to start by showing us a video today, right?
As a society, we value community, public safety, and even second chances. Yet, across the United States, there are countless people who are being subjected to the torture of solitary confinement. And although many have not survived such dehumanizing conditions, for those who do, they have lived long enough to tell their truth, share their journeys of resilience, and more importantly, to challenge our moral compass. Here's what they had to say.
I am the coordinator for the Virginia Coalition on Solitary Confinement. Our bill is bipartisan. We are trying to pass a bill which will mirror the HALT bill with limiting solitary confinement to 15 days within a 60-day time span. So far, I have been trying to build the members of the coalition with bringing in community members and faith-based leaders, directly impacted people, and the loved ones of incarcerated people. We currently were on an 8-week tour throughout the state, speaking with Republican delegates. The state is very different from what I'm accustomed to because I'm a New York native. So it's been kind of hard, but I'm diligent and I'm passionate about this. This is personal for me. I myself was in solitary confinement for 4 years while incarcerated in a New York State prison. When you break a spirit, this is not like healing a broken leg. A broken leg heals itself. You break a spirit, that person has become like an infant. It will depend on you for everything because the person does not understand how to function like as if they were, among other people anymore. Some people never come back from that. I also suffer a lot from my time in solitary confinement. I'm extremely needy emotionally, but space-wise, I want company, but I don't want them once they get here. I'm used to being alone. And I function better alone. I have problems with expressing my feelings when I'm irritable, and I'm easily agitated. So, it's been hard. However, if I would have not gone through prison as an adult, solitary confinement, a failed marriage, domestic abuse, I wouldn't be able to save anybody. You can do all the talking you want from books, but a person in your face that has survived the type of traumas that I've survived gives you hope that it can be done, because I did it. So, like I said, this is my mission. If you don't believe it, try locking yourself in the bathroom for a whole day. For a whole day. You have water, you have everything you need there. Toilet, water. Try it and see how it feels. Treat people how you want to be treated. I don't care who they are. You should be good to everyone. Not just people that are free, not just people that you think didn't make a mistake. To everyone. That is how humankind survives. You have to be thoughtful and caring. And you will see that this is wrong. That's it. That's all I have to say.
It's a very powerful video, Ron. And I really thought that, is that Natasha White? I didn't catch her name.
That is Natasha White.
She, speaking from her experience, is also very powerful, and it certainly resonates with what I experienced working at San Quentin. But would you like to say more about the video?
Yeah, and thanks everybody for coming together today to talk about how we can listen to the voices of folks like Natasha. She didn't go into prison that way. She came out of prison this way because of her 4 years in solitary confinement. Solitary confinement is a form of torture. It is linked to self-mutilation, to suicide, heart disease, anxiety, depression, psychosis, mental and physical deterioration, and a significantly heightened risk of death, not while you're in solitary, but after you're out, when you're trying to deal with the torture that you endured. So placement in solitary confinement for any length of time, whether days or even hours, can cause severe harm. So I'm not just, Natasha laid out the moral reasons. These are the physical and psychological reasons from mental health experts and brain science experts that I just cited for you about solitary confinement. And as you heard from Natasha, she was in for 4 years in solitary confinement. She's a success story. She's out of solitary, out of prison. She's organizing with the state campaign that NEARCAT has. We have 20 state campaigns around the country. She's doing the Virginia state campaign. She's also working with the Maryland state campaign right now. But also, as you heard, she knows that she'll never be the same after enduring that level and that duration of torture. And what she says is so true. And these are the people we don't hear from. These are the people we don't see. Many will never come back to a meaningful level of functionality from that experience of torture. A little bit about how we got this video. And actually, I'm trying to model something for you all, because this is a way to bring the voices of survivors front and center in our work, which I think we have to do no matter what our issue is. We have to bring the voices of the people that have the direct experience to the forefront. This interview with Natasha was one of 30 interviews with solitary survivors that the National Religious Campaign Against Torture filmed, and we're slowly releasing these out into the public. It's called Humans Out of Solitary, and you can go to our nearcat.org website and you can grab one and show it to start your next meeting. If you want to have people, instead of hearing people like me talk about it, have somebody who's been there talk about solitary confinement. USA Today helped us launch the series in 2022. They did an interview. They took one of the interviews, not Natasha, and they did an op-ed calling for an end to solitary. Just in April, John Oliver has a series on HBO called Last Week Tonight, where he covers newsworthy topics. He picked up one of these interviews with Joseph De La Luz, who's another solitary survivor, and he talks about the myth that solitary confinement is where the worst of the worst are. and talks about what he saw in prison when he was in solitary. People getting put into solitary confinement because they had one too many cigarettes. They wore the wrong shoes to yard. They didn't finish their food. They said something a corrections officer didn't like. And the list goes on and on in many of our prisons and jails around the country. Solitary confinement is sort of the default to anytime anybody on the staff has a problem with somebody, in they go. The John Oliver segment on HBO, by the way, at this point has over 3.4 million views in the US and worldwide. So part of my theme is that we are trying to strike a chord with this education because we believe that the change will inevitably follow. It's almost impossible to meet somebody right now who says solitary confinement is a good thing. Father George talked about how they've made some of the changes at San Quentin, and other prisons are making the change. But we feel like we need to have legislation passed in these 20 states that we're working in, and then in the federal government. Our brain trust, I would say, we have legal advocates, we have faith institutions, disability and human rights organizations, prison reform advocates, and of course, the folks who've been in solitary themselves, the survivors, are all working together to try to get a new bill passed in Washington, D.C. And it's going to take time, but we're just about ready to release it. There are over 11,000 people in the federal prison system, including immigrant detention, who are held in solitary confinement each day. That means that there's 11,000 people in some small little cell somewhere in the federal system that are experiencing the same thing that Natasha experienced. Very few did anything to deserve this, and no one does anything to deserve torture. That's the bottom line at NEARCAT. There is no reason on God's green earth to torture someone, no matter what they did or what you think they did. That's something that Muslims, Catholics, Protestants, Sikhs, Unitarians, Jews, we all agree that that is the moral status, if you will, of torture. Right now, anywhere from 65 to 120,000 people are being held in these cells. If you add up the federal system, the immigrant detention system, the state systems, and then the local jails, being held in conditions of torture right now, experiencing what we know they're probably going to feel, similar to what Natasha still feels. Even though she's a success story, she can't put that out of her mind. No one can when they've been subject to torture. And the United States is a huge outlier among advanced democracies in its widespread use of solitary confinement. Norway, Germany, most of the European countries, there's just a few people in solitary confinement out of the whole place. So our federal bill is really to try to push in alignment with public opinion, and also in alignment with a pledge that President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris made in their 2020 campaign. They pledged to try to end solitary confinement. Now they made a lot of other pledges that haven't made it. But the idea of our legislation, it's coming from Congressmember Cori Bush, who is, I think, one of the emerging civil rights leaders in our nation. She came out of the Ferguson experience. She's from St. Louis. She herself understands what it's like for people to be in solitary confinement. She's from the African-American community, pastor. She is really, at this point, wanting to try to rally the progressives around this, because there's not enough people working on this, and rally the moderates around this. You say, why do we introduce a bill in Washington, D.C.? They can't even come up with an agreement on how to keep the federal government operating. So it's horribly divided. But recent polling shows a different story. that across the political spectrum, there is support for federal legislation that would end solitary confinement and only allow the use of solitary when there's an emergency situation where there was a serious injury, which, as I told earlier in the Joseph de la Luz example, that's not why people are in solitary. They didn't hurt somebody. They didn't have a fight. They just got placed in there for any number of different administrative reasons. There was a University of Maryland poll that came out that we cite often, that those who would like to see solitary confinement ended, except for these emergency situations, includes 78% of Democrats, 61% of independents, and 51% of Republicans. So there is widespread support for either President Biden or Vice President Harris to make good on their campaign pledge, or for people to take a close look at a bill, a federal bill to end solitary confinement, at least in the federal system. And like I said, the 10% of people in solitary are in the federal systems. There's 90% that are in the states and the jails. So that's why we have really at this point a very well-developed state campaign structure built. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but also, you know, you have to realize, where can you put political pressure? The current head of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, Colette Peters, is a known reformer of solitary confinement. I've met her a number of times when she was the head of the system in Oregon. And we believe she is about in the process of trying to initiate a study to see just how far the federal government can go, how far the Bureau of Prisons can go in reforming their practices around solitary confinement. So I wanted to set that up before I go into some of the details on the actual legislation, because it will also help you kind of see how we're thinking about this from the perspective of somebody who's been in solitary, how you would actually design a prison system that could eliminate solitary confinement. So before I do that, I was wanting to stop and see if anybody had any thoughts or questions about what I've said so far from your own experience, or even what Natasha was able to raise in her video.
You know, I'll go first, in the sense that what she said, Natasha said, was about really a person's lived experience that she had is so much more vivid than just reading about it in books. Although, having read about it a lot in books when I was doing my doctoral research, Craig Haney's written a lot about this, and there are a lot of really good studies that support everything she said. But I also know from my work at San Quentin, having met some of the men when I first got there, one in particular I recall, he had spent 18 years in solitary confinement, and he was not, when I met him, he was in the hospital. They had established a psychiatric treatment part of the hospital for all the people who had gone through solitary for years prior. So in a way, it was sort of trying to fix all the damage they had done. But in his case, you know, he had been for 18 years, and he was illiterate, so he couldn't just sit there and read books. He had no television, nothing. He just was sitting there for all those years, and he was pretty much out of his mind. And then, to what you were saying earlier, he died within 2 years of being released from solitary. So it took a tremendous toll on his psyche as well as his body. So everything you and she said is certainly borne out, both in the books and in the, unfortunately, the tragically lived experience of these people. Anybody else would like to kind of join in with some questions or comments, please do. Please feel free. You can unmute and then put yourself on video if you wish.
Hi, Bob Tebow from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Wisconsin being one of the worst places in the country for criminal justice. We keep fighting issues. Solitary, in our case, the county jail has been the biggest problem. We've had 4 deaths in custody at the jail in, I think it's 9 months. And in many cases, what's happening is solitary confinement is being used as a way to manage mental health issues. You have somebody who's picked up because they're in a mental health crisis. And of course, the solution for that is to put them in jail, because we've cut our mental health treatment facilities. They get into jail and they're not given medication because we have a privatized system that doesn't want to spend money on medications. So they're still in crisis. So they're acting out in jail. So then they're put in solitary, which is, of course, the best way to treat somebody who's having a mental health crisis. So we've been fighting with the sheriff and trying to work with the county board since almost a year ago. We finally got the county, and the sheriff keeps saying that she's independent because she's a separately elected official and she doesn't want to tell anybody what's going on. We finally just are getting the county board, because they have financial oversight. We may pass a resolution to audit the sheriff's department later this month. But getting the county supervisors to take action has been almost impossible. It was the fourth death in custody that finally did some things. So I don't know what your reaction is, what you have experienced as far as solitary being used as mental health treatment. But I wanted to raise that issue.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. Oh, I mean, it very much has taken on the mental health crisis in our country. The prisons have. And you can talk to prison administrators and they say it's because nobody else wants to do it, or whatever excuse they have. They know that coming through those doors are a lot of people that have severe or this not mental health crisis that was caused by being in solitary, but came with mental health crisis through their front door. And so the default is, because a lot of these therapeutic alternatives aren't around, the default is just to place someone inside a solitary confinement cell. And I describe that as pouring gasoline on a fire, because that is really what you're doing to the mind of this person in almost all cases. And if they can, or when they can get their medications, it might be better, but it's not much better. The isolation, I've gone to a few experimental places inside prisons where they've actually opened the cells up and have congregate settings and people are getting their meds. And it's so different from the places where they just have folks locked inside their cells and they're just screaming and banging on the doors of the cells all day long. And so I really appreciate what you're doing at your local jail, because there are a lot of deaths in jails. And let's remember, jails are places where people are being held under suspicion of something. They've never actually been convicted of anything. And so systemically, we do need to work at the state prison level, and we need to work at the local jails level, and we just need to keep the pressure on. And a number of our friends in disability rights and other groups are suing the jails over these conditions. And I think over 3 cases alone there in California, George, in San Jose, the county taxpayers have paid out over $20 million in settlements over what they did, the abuse that they did to cause serious harm. One guy is now a paraplegic while he was hurt inside solitary confinement, and they just ignored him and said he was faking it and just left him in there. And there were a couple of other cases. So the taxpayers ended up paying $20 million just over 3 cases. So this isn't good for the county. It's not good for the constituencies that support prisons. And it's certainly not good for the people who have to serve inside those institutions. That wears them down. The guards and the corrections officers get worn down by that environment, and their life expectancy is as low, George, as you had mentioned, where somebody came out and died a couple of years later. Their life expectancy of a prison guard is way lower than the average worker in this society. So there's a lot of social intersections of some social problems that happen, that
Mhm.
really solitary confinement is one of the nexus. It's not the only nexus, but it certainly is a place that we ask people to look, because that is where you can see things that have really gone wrong in our society, is by looking into those cells. Who's there? Who's having to guard or to do the corrections piece in that really horrible environment.
You know, I was thinking about that as you were talking, and my experience both in Massachusetts and here at San Quentin was the people who work as correctional officers in those settings are definitely affected in a negative way. There's kind of a corrosiveness, there's a moral injury that's going on with a lot of them. And I know that there, as you said, the life expectancy of the CO is about 59 years old.
Yeah.
And their suicide rate is among the highest in the country of any profession, and it's even more so for those who work, who have worked for a period of time in these solitary confinement regimes. I wanted to ask a clarification. Yvette Garland it says that she asks how much time constitutes solitary confinement. She volunteers in a prison that routinely has 24-hour lockdowns, which she notes is still torture. But as I recall, it was like 10 to 14 days by UN standards. Solitary constituted torture, but I don't know if that's changed at all. Do you have those numbers, Ron?
Yeah, let me actually get into what we're proposing with this federal legislation, because it'll get to some of this. You're right. If we want to end solitary confinement in federal prisons, jails, and the other detention centers, with the exceptions that I stated, we need to set some serious restrictions around how solitary confinement is used. For example, we have built into the bill that you can only put someone in solitary confinement, or you can only do a lockdown for 4 hours for emergency de-escalation. Why do we come up with you can only lock it down for 4 hours? Because we had a conversation with a head of a state system who was, I think it was Connecticut. When 9/11 happened, they locked it down, and he said that within 4 to 8 hours at the maximum, they were able to open it back up again. Now, what kind of a crisis could you possibly have that would be more conducive to a lockdown? He said, look, you really don't need to have it more longer than that. And so a lot of prisons lock down for much longer periods. So in this bill, we have specifically said that you can only lock down for 4 hours. For emergency de-escalation, or I think there was a federal lockdown when the George Floyd protests were happening that lasted for days, just because somebody was worried that could spread into the prisons. Who knows? So we've got some very strict requirements on lockdowns, and we do actually go beyond the minimum standards that were set by the United Nations. The United Nations, what's called the Mandela Rules, which a lot of our state legislation is actually modeled after. It bans solitary confinement for 15 days. After 15 days, they say that's the threshold for isolation. After 15 days, this is where brain science has established that the human brain and the impact on the individual goes from detention to the physical manifestation and signs of torture. That's what happens on day 15. So as we were writing this legislation, why do we want to take people to the brink of torture and say, okay, after 15 days, now they're being tortured, so let them out? So we actually set a very stringent rule where no one can spend more than 8 hours a day with sleep time, which is basically sleep time, isolated in their cell. Not 15 days, not 8 days, but 8 hours. Now, we know that for youth and for folks with severe mental illness, even 1 hour inside solitary confinement can be trauma-inducing to the point that it will change their lives. So a lot of states have actually banned placing youth and people with severe mental illness in solitary confinement at all. They're not following the 15-day rule. They just say, we can't do it. Georgia and a few other states have passed laws that say you cannot place pregnant people or postpartum people in solitary confinement, just again because of the danger, and have banned that. But we, in our bill, said we don't think anybody should spend time isolated in a cell without access to congregant settings, programming. Now, here's what I want to say about that. We have we're at the Catholic Social Ministry gathering every year. During COVID, we missed it. I don't know how many of you have ever been there or know that it happens in Washington, D.C. We have a virtual reality experience of solitary confinement that we bring there, and people get a little bit of a taste of that. And they say, oh my God, I can't believe anybody could survive more than 5 minutes. We also have a mock solitary confinement cell. And Bob, that actually, we borrowed it from some Wisconsin advocates. What is your Gamaliel? You have a Gamaliel affiliate in Wisconsin, I forget. Anyway, we borrowed the idea of actually constructing an actual life-size solitary confinement cell that has to be hauled around in a truck. And we've used that at some conferences and still have it. So I sat in that cell. We let people sit in it for 5 minutes. I sat in that cell the first time, and we have the screams and everything that you hear when you're in solitary confinement, the pounding. And within 3 minutes, without me even knowing that I was doing it, and I'm the person that, helped build this thing, without me even knowing it, I started to count the bricks that were painted. They were painted bricks on the wall within 3 minutes. And I didn't know it. My brain had already switched into a gear that was just scary to me. And so here again, our federal legislation, we don't want to take people to the brink of torture. We really want people to understand, and people do understand, that it starts before 15 days. We do have, for folks that do need longer term separation in the bill, we do have that, and the construction of alternative units. But again, everybody who's in the federal facilities under this bill has to have meaningful access to out of cell time and group programming. Okay, what does that mean? At least 14 hours of out of cell time, 7 of those some form of daily group programming, because you're going to go back into your own cell for at least 8 hours to sleep. So educational, vocational, mental health programming, violence prevention programming, alcohol and substance abuse treatment, reentry programming, religious programming, although that's in its own category, volunteer groups, time in the day room, meals, law library. Those are the things that you would have access to if you were in a isolated cell, because at that point it stops being isolation and it starts to be restorative and rehabilitative, and you have less of a chance of coming out like Natasha and people who've come out much worse than that. Social and legal telephone calls. A lot of people can't complete their courses for what they want to do when they get out of prison. If they get caught, like Joseph was saying in that one clip that we had on HBO, if you get caught with an extra cigarette and some CO doesn't like it and you're in solitary, that's the end of that program and you have to start over again. So we're thinking not just about what happens to the human person inside, but also how we begin to transition somebody into the rehabilitation mode, which we have to do in our prisons, because 90% of them are going to be outside, on the outside, 95% or something are going to be on the outside. We have due process protections because we believe that people should have access to representation. And we actually prohibit anybody being placed in solitary in a federal facility unless they engaged in some kind of grave and dangerous behavior that resulted in an injury or poses a risk to someone. But even then, they have the right to a hearing and right to representation at that hearing. We have oversight mechanisms built into this federal legislation, including a private cause of action. You can actually sue. and we have community monitoring, and we also have, and this is a little bit controversial, I know, but we also want to have media access, because one of the reasons they get away with this is that nobody knows what's happening inside our prisons. So we're really pushing that issue, although that's a tough one. That's a tough sell. We also incentivize states and municipalities that will adopt restrictions on solitary confinement within their own states. So we are trying to use some of the federal budget and some of the different burn JAG programs and other funding streams that are out there that states utilize to create incentives for states to take action on their own and to build some of this criteria into the scoring of federal funding. So I know that's a lot, and you probably didn't want to have to sit here and hear the whole thing about a breakdown of a bill. But if anybody did it, and I hope I answered that question about how long in solitary, because as George mentioned, there is the UN definition of 15 days where it becomes what you see in torture victims. But then there's us saying, look, we've got to not let anybody get close to that line. It's just not something we have to do. We don't need to do it, and we shouldn't be doing it. And therefore, let's stop doing it.
I also throw in both you and Father George have mentioned the whole idea of the corrections officers. I think sometimes solitary is used by the COs because they don't know what else to do or whatever. Just now, let's link this with the webinar we just had, Father George, on building bridges with corrections staff. If we can work with the corrections staff themselves, as that all was pointing out, so they find better ways to de-escalate. I had got the book that was mentioned and read it quickly, and I mailed it to our Secretary of Corrections for Wisconsin, who, by the way, is a Catholic. And waiting to hear from him. If we can help the staffs find ways to manage people better than just locking them up, that might help the problem too.
I think that's a key point. And the thing that we will never succeed in doing any of these reforms if we don't get buy-in from the people who work in the prison system. And they have to be convinced in some way that it's to their benefit that we adopt some of these changes in the way we do handle prisoners on all different levels. But certainly the people who work in the solitary confinement part of the prison, I found that they were among the most difficult people to work with because they had been, again, in their own ways, victimized and traumatized by the environment that they were exposed to. So, I think that's something that we all need to consider, especially when we're talking about legislation, that getting some kind of buy-in from the CO unions and things like that is essential. And Ron, you're on mute.
Yeah, that's going to be difficult, but it's something we absolutely have to register. One of the early COs who really stood up against this, Lance Lowry, who was with the union in Texas. NERCAT also has a feature-length film called Torture in Our Name, which is a 35-minute film, and it highlights the campaigns in Louisiana, in New Jersey, and New York. But like I said, we have other campaigns. But Lance Lowry, who was the head of the prison union, said, this is not a career move for me to oppose solitary confinement. They're working in a very difficult culture, and it's a culture that where and we see it in our national politics too, where if you want your members to make sure that you stay in there as the union president, you want to make sure that they know that you're keeping them from getting killed by these murderers that are inside this prison. I mean, that's the kind of rhetoric you hear from some of these folks. And actually, I saw the John Oliver segment is posted. Thank you, Kara, for posting that John Oliver segment. If you do take the time to watch that, they actually talk to the head of the uh, corrections union in New York City. It is just, he is a scary person. He has no right being a leader of these folks and really trying to intimidate his own members in order to keep his power base the way he's built it over the years. It almost feels like mob type of stuff. And so people are subject to a lot of I guess negative reinforcement, I might say, when they do wake up to this. But I do think that it's changing, and it's partly changing from some of the state heads of corrections, like I mentioned earlier, Colette Peters, the head of the Colorado system, the head of the North Dakota system, pulled back almost half of the solitary confinement there. Their state leaders are, through their association, are really trying to pull along some of the line staff and some of their unions along with them. So I think that's where the crack in the wall is going to happen, as we look at the strategy for how we engage folks at that level. And Michigan has a very vibrant program that their union is sponsoring, where they've got folks sitting around and talking with each other about, okay, isn't there a better way to do this? And they agree there is. But they haven't figured out, okay, institutionally, how do we put our voices into this mix?
And I wonder, in crafting the legislation, was there input from correctional professionals like correctional officers and administrators? Because I think, what you're describing in terms of the reforms makes sense to those of us who are coming at it from more of a treatment or a pastoral side. But I think there are certainly arguments that can be made from the other side, say of the correctional side, that would say it's really, this is better, this is to their benefit as well. And I'm just wondering if that's been addressed.
Yeah, we have talked with them, and there's nothing in here that would do anything but improve their prisons. Now, the ones that will talk to us are the ones who agree with us, but they've been around the block enough to know that these are the kind of reforms that we need to make, that makes everybody's job a lot easier and treats people like the human beings that they are. So like I said, we consulted with the former head of the Connecticut, the head of the Colorado system. Says in all his years there, he only met one person that he would never let out of his cell. The rest of them, they have no business being put in these kind of situations. So they know that you need to not have people locked away like this. They know that. And we checked on some of the hour restrictions, and probably one piece of feedback we got from them is, how are we going to do this? What's your plan? And we kind of had to say, that's your job. Our job is to say what the human beings that are in there need. And now your job is to figure it out. If you need to go get more funding, fine. If you want to follow the studies that we have out in New York and California that say you actually save money by eliminating solitary confinement, and you increase safety in the prisons by eliminating solitary confinement, which both of those studies say, if you want to follow those studies, then follow those, and you'll make money by doing this. It's, we only can go so far with a piece of legislation. They would have to figure out how to institute it.
And it seems to me to hold out the possibility of working together with them to craft that, rather than say it's up to you, do it, because they won't do it on their own. I just wanted to mention or ask a question. Someone asked, is the proposed bill, the federal bill, posted on the website anywhere? And do you have that information?
Yeah, we don't, because it is not introduced yet. And we do, however, have talking points on the bill and the bill summary. And at this point, we have probably 150 national organizations that are signed on in support of the bill, or what will be the bill. There are others that are waiting to see the actual bill itself, but we have an amazing cross-section of national human and civil rights organizations, mental illness organizations, medical organizations. We have faith organizations that are signed on to this bill saying, yes, if we want to do something to kind of turn what happens inside our prisons on its head and do rehabilitation instead of punishment, this is a good place to start. So let me say a little bit about the states. And also the advocacy, that advocacy matters. I'm gonna look at New York, because in 2022, the halt solitary confinement law went into effect in New York, and it covers all prisons and jails in the state. And the role of the faith community in New York, as in many of our other states, was tangible. Cardinal Dolan and the State Catholic Conference had a significant role with us. It was a 15-day limit bill. It was a bill that established therapeutic alternatives. Cardinal Dolan actually put out a very important op-ed at a key moment where Cuomo was being pressed to sign the bill, and then he finally did sign the bill. It had passed the New York State Legislature. The Protestant New York Council of Churches was instrumental. Trua, a rabbinic voice for justice, was instrumental in the New York campaign. Many others fought for 8 years, okay? 8 years they fought to get this bill to the point where it would pass, because they wouldn't compromise on, when they started, forget 15-day limits. They were saying, well, maybe we can get it. Maybe we can stop holding them for a decade, you know. That's what they were hearing. And they said, no, we want a 15-day limit. They fought for 8 years and they got that. If Tom were on here from the Jesuit conference, he's been talking with us about putting together some Catholic principles on the issue of solitary confinement, and something that can be used in the Catholic community. So I'm sure Tom will have more to say, and hopefully can get it to you, Karen, and to distribute out to folks, because it's something that we kind of sat down and said, look, there's a lot of Catholic thinking around torture and around prison. And so he's going to try to put that together. But here's what happened in New York when we passed this bill. New York State closed a supermax prison dedicated to solitary confinement, where there was a long history of torture there, the South Point Correctional Facility. They ended one of the forms of solitary confinement, which is called keep lock, where somebody in the chat mentioned, where somebody gets put in a cell 23 to 24 hours a day for days on end. They just ended that. They don't do that anymore. They don't put somebody in the cell for 23 to 24 hours a day. They try to do something to get them out periodically throughout the day. The New York prisons dramatically reduced the use of one of their main forms of solitary, which is called they call them a special housing unit. I don't know if you've heard of the phrase SHU. They reduced the SHUs. In February of 2022, I think that was when it might have been right before the bill was implemented, there were 1,800 people on any given day in the SHUs in New York City. A year later, a little over a year later, it went from 1,800 people in the SHUs to now 370 people in the SHUs. Okay, so you pass the state bill, and the corrections folks, even though they're fighting this, you know, George, they're still fighting us on this. They're fighting us over, oh, well, we shouldn't have to do this, but they're slowly trying to implement the bill. And we're able to reduce solitary confinement from 1,800 people down to 370. That's 1,400 people that if those activists, those faith leaders had not pulled together to get this bill passed, to make it illegal to put people in solitary confinement for prolonged periods of time, there'd be 1,400 other people right now in New York that are sitting in these little 6x9 cells. So it makes a huge difference. They used to have people in New York that would spend months and even years in these SHUs, solitary confinement. As of this May, I believe, and it's really hard to get any reliable figures from prisons, but as of May, the average length of stay is 10 days. Now, this is from a system that had people in for years and decades. The average length of stay is 10 days now, and the maximum is 35 days by their figures. I mean, that's still way too long, but that's a whole lot better than 1 year or 10 years. And then, as we talked about earlier, they are putting together these operating alternative units. They call them residential rehabilitation units, where people aren't getting the full time out of cell, but they're getting some out of cell group programming rather than what it was before, where they were just locked in a cell 23 to 24 hours a day. So that's one state, one bill that the activists took eight years to pass, and it's having tremendous impact. And like I said, it's not popular with everybody, and there's people that are trying to undo it. But it is having the impact. So I think people of goodwill inside the prison systems are trying to follow the law, not just because it's the law, but because I think a lot of them know that this really is the right thing to do. And, you know, now they need to get their rehabilitation units need to get into the funding stream instead of other ways that they were using the money. So, you know, they've got to make some adjustment. Now, once they pass the bill, they're still monitoring the regulations that implement the bill. They're still mobilizing people, including the legislators who passed HALT. I was just with some of the legislators in New York last week. They're submitting comments anytime there are proposed regulations. They're trying to monitor when the regulations are being disregarded by certain institutions. They're holding rallies still outside the city hall, outside the governor's office. The solitary survivors are providing their testimonies. They're using email. They've gotten a lot of good media attention. There, I think at Rikers, which is their city jail, Bob, I think 13 or 14 people have already died this year, okay, in the jail. So they've also got a campaign with the city. So even once you pass the law, this isn't really about passing. Okay, it is about passing the law because you heard what happened in New York. This is about building a community of people who can hold those who manage and run and fund this system accountable. A community of people that's going to stick together through the whole thing. It's going to be survivors, it's going to be faith leaders, it's going to be advocates who know that this system was not built in a day and it's not going to be changed in a day. But I use the New York example because it really is a case study of how none of this would have happened. You know, some states, like I said, North Dakota, the state administrator just cut it in half. Some states, New York was not going to do that. So we needed the legislation. That's pretty much what I have to say. And I hope everybody got a little bit of a framework here. Please utilize those Humans Out of Solitary videos. Take a look at Torture in Our Name, which is that 35-minute. It focuses on the campaigns that have brought reforms, at least in New York and New Jersey. Both have passed laws that have ended prolonged solitary. And then Connecticut just passed their law, and the governor signed it last year, that ends prolonged solitary in the state. Right. Take a look at that. Use them in your presentations. They're all there for you to have. They're all free to use however you see fit in your advocacy. And we're always there, ready to help. We're in conversation with Tom and Ingrid and others in the national scene, but we're glad to talk through with folks at the local level too.
Well, thank you so much, Ron. And we can put links to those resources on our CPM website as well. And the reason we're doing these advocacy panels is because we realize that we have so many people who are passionate about reforming the system that we have. And this is what you highlight is the road ahead of us is difficult, but it can be done. But it's going to take time. It's going to take all of us participating in some way. Karen Clifton mentioned to me that June is International Anti-Torture Month. So this is also a very apt conversation to be having at this time. So thank you again, Ron, and for all of you for participating. And please stay tuned for more CPMC programs in the future.